Robert Kennedy was a very complex person, but he was not very complicated. And just as him is our organization. It's you cannot explain Robert Kennedy in 2 minutes. And you cannot explain what we do in 2 minutes. And we're not a historical society that does these events all the time. It's this is our 50th anniversary, and we really reserve all the historical photographs and footage for special events that commemorate the organization. But if you are going to learn more about Robert Kennedy now from somebody who I've highly valued for many years, but although I've never met him personally before. I've only known him as the West Wing Report on Twitter. His name is Paul Brandus. We have invited Paul Brandus, who has worked in the White House as a journalist for the last decade, covering Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump. He's a columnist for USA Today, the third biggest newspaper in the United States. He's the author of 2 books and a frequent speaker at presidential libraries, Fortune 500 companies, and universities. His media company, West Wing Reports, also provides television and radio clients with direct reports from the White House. His Twitter account, as I mentioned before, West Wing Report, is one of the most popular among all White House journalists and correspondents. And speaking of the Kennedy family, he's writing a new book about Jacqueline Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's wife at the time. And because he needs more information, he decided to come over and collect information for his book. No, he will tell you about Robert Kennedy, and you're going to hear from somebody who you're not going to see that often in this country. And I'm very happy you're here. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Brandus.
Thank you very much. I think I am going to come back. I had dinner with Nadine and Jerry, and apparently they live right next to a winery. Is that right? So I'm going to come back. Well, guten Abend and danke. Thank you, and thank you very much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me to be back in Zurich. I've been here many times, not in about 15 years or so, but 5 or 6 times altogether. And I always love coming here, and Switzerland in general. So it's a real treat for me to be able to come here. And I thank you. Let's see if this thing works here. There we go. So that's the building where I work. It's called the White House. You needs no introduction. That's only one small portion of the building. The press room where I work is actually just to, does this have a laser pointer, by the way? I don't know. Just to the right of that, and the West Wing, where the president's work is out of the picture, but it's over on this side. And as Chris said, I've been working there now for about 10 years, covering Presidents Bush, Presidents Obama, President Trump. They're all quite different, as you know. For better or worse, and the history of it is just fascinating, so it's a real, needless to say, an interesting time to be there right now. But we're going to talk about Robert Kennedy for just a little bit. Now Robert Kennedy was a man who, like a lot of heroes, died before his ultimate promise could be fulfilled. Now, that Guggenheim film that you just saw captured a lot of that. And after all this time, half a century ago, it still remains. It's a very powerful film, very eloquent, very sad as well. And Chris mentioned that I'm working on a new book about Jacqueline Kennedy. And I'm actually going to start this discussion tonight with an anecdote about Jacqueline Kennedy, because it actually relates to Robert as well. In the latter period of her own life, she gave very few interviews, but one interview that she gave to the New York Times a couple of years before her own death, she gave a very interesting quote. She said, and I'm quoting here, "When you look back on your own life, you hardly recognize the person you once were. It's like a snake shedding skins. Each phase of your life, you shed a different skin." And Robert Kennedy, I think, lived that kind of life as well. But the one life he never got to lead is the one that we saw in the Guggenheim film. What if he had won the presidency in 1968? What might that have done for America? What would my country have been like? What would the rest of the world been like? And I think that is sort of the one question that even half a century later haunts so many people. It's this tragic, unanswerable question that I think can be asked with just two words. What if? Think about that. What if? What if he had lived? What if he had won? What might that have meant? And we could apply that question to his older brother, by the way, of course, John F. Kennedy. What if he had lived? Would there have been Vietnam? Would there have been Nixon? Would there have been Watergate? Would there have been all the cynicism, all the anger, all the distrust, all the feelings of hopelessness and despair that sometimes ripples across the United States? I think we're feeling some of that right now, in fact. What might have happened if he had lived? And what if after John F. Kennedy's murder, what if Robert Kennedy quit politics? He nearly did. He almost did. He nearly went to work for a law firm. He thought about becoming the president of a university. He thought about getting out of politics altogether. He never did, as you know. So the fact that he chose to remain in politics, run for the Senate from the state of New York, I think was hardly preordained. And his run for the presidency in 1968, by the way, was hardly preordained either. We also assume that he would have won in 1968, perhaps not. There was a vice president at the time, Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, who actually was the front runner at the time of Senator Kennedy's death. Now, Kennedy was catching up, but it would have been quite a, I think he might have caught Humphrey, but again, there are no guarantees. Do you agree with that, Nadine, by the way? That's an interesting point. So there's no guarantee that he even would have gotten the nomination to face Richard Nixon. But nevertheless, that is the question, what if? And I think that's part of the tragedy. We will never know what might have happened. We can speculate, for example, that if Kennedy had won, if he had become president, he might have gotten America out of Vietnam earlier than Richard Nixon did. On the other hand, he might have found out that Vietnam was as complicated and messy as Nixon did. We'll never know. Kennedy talked about getting out, but it was a big mess. He might not have been able to get out as quickly as people think. It might have been perhaps a bit of maybe a too romantic a view that he could have done it so easily. Also, Nixon went to China in 1972. He opened up that country to the rest of the world. It was a monumental event that continues to shape our world today. Would Bobby Kennedy have gone to China? Nobody knows. Nixon also went 3 months later to the Soviet Union, and he signed a big arms treaty that would put both countries on a path to reducing nuclear weapons. Not a bad thing. Would Bobby Kennedy have gone to Moscow? Nobody knows. So interesting questions. What would Bobby Kennedy have done if he had won? I do think, however, that Kennedy would have done things about the environment. We have something in our country called the Environmental Protection Agency, which is not being protected very well at the moment. But I think Bobby Kennedy would have been all over that. He would have made great efforts to make the air we breathe, the water we drink cleaner. He would have expanded, and we saw this in the Guggenheim film, by the way, he would have expanded education, aid programs for the poor, no question about it. The other big question is, what if he had won? Would we have avoided some of the Nixon? I talked about some of the decent things Nixon did, about going to China and the arms reduction deals. What about the bad, the nasty things that Nixon did? Would we have had Watergate? Well, probably not. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that when Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General, he approved the wiretapping of Martin Luther King, for example, the civil rights leader. And Kennedy, in fact, said at the time, well, go ahead, don't get caught. He wanted to be personally informed about anything pertinent that the FBI could dig up on King. So the FBI broke into King's house and apartment and installed these listening bugs. If we want to be honest here, that was also part of Bobby Kennedy's legacy. So the question is, as president, what might he have done? Now, I mentioned before the snake shedding skins. I think that was a part of his life that he left behind as he evolved over the years. Nevertheless, we have to acknowledge some of the things that, that he did that might have been questionable. It's important to remember that politicians are not angels. They have problems, they have rivals, they have enemies to deal with. So again, I think it all comes back to the question, what if? Meantime, there's this question, just who was Robert Francis Kennedy? Now, the Guggenheim film touched upon some of that, but if you'll indulge me, I'll expand on that just a little bit. Robert Kennedy was, you would not hear the word complacent used in conjunction with Robert Kennedy. He was an action guy. He was always doing things, trying to do more, trying to make people's lives better. He was always trying to improve himself personally. While he was shaving and getting dressed in the morning, he would listen to records of Shakespeare's plays. Is anybody under 30 in the room here or so? Just as an aside, I'll say a record is a round piece of plastic, and you put it on a thing called a record player, and out comes sound. It's quite amazing. But I digress. But he listened to these records every morning to better himself. One of his favorites was Henry V. And whenever times got tough, whenever friends were in trouble, maybe in a jam, he would always come back to Henry V. And he would often quote the very famous lines from the St. Crispin's Day speech, and I'll quote just a little bit of it. This is one of the things that really moved him almost as much as anything. And I'm quoting here, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. He absolutely loved those lines. He would repeat them all the time. And in a broader sense, what that meant for Robert Kennedy, this was his way of mocking fear. Even if you were afraid of something, he said, do not show fear. Just ignore it and be courageous. Act as if you're not afraid of anything. And that's what he did. It was his black Irish humor that he had that sustained him through some pretty tough times that he had. Now, unlike his older brothers, John F. Kennedy and Joseph Kennedy, the senior brother in that family, Robert Kennedy never saw combat in World War II. He was not a war hero. And I think that kind of bothered him a little bit. To him, it was maybe a sort of a bit of an insecurity thing with him. So perhaps to compensate, he would often surround himself with tough people, people he admired who did tough things, men who climbed Mount Everest, heroes from the invasion of Normandy, the anniversary of which is tomorrow, as you may know. He liked hanging out with astronauts. One of his best friends, in fact, was John Glenn, the astronaut, the second man but the first American to orbit the Earth. In Robert Kennedy's eyes, courage was always a moral test. He didn't like it when men cried. You've got to be tough, don't be afraid, and keep going forward. I think the Guggenheim film said one of his mantras was always lean forward. That was what he did. In his desk, he kept a copy of Douglas MacArthur's Medal of Honor citation from the First World War, and at a dinner party in 1960, somebody asked him, he said, well, if you could live your life all over again, what would you do? And he said, I would be a paratrooper. That's what he said. And then, of course, came the event that changed everything, the assassination of his brother. Has anybody seen this picture before? Some of you perhaps have. This is a picture that was taken minutes after Bobby Kennedy learned that his brother, the president, had been killed. He was at home in Virginia that day having lunch. This is his backyard. Two of his sons came over to embrace him. It's a tragic photo. And Robert Kennedy was just absolutely devastated by the death of his brother. He was devoured by grief. It just completely took over his life. He couldn't sleep. He lost weight. He often just stared into space, deep in thought. I think the movie said he was never a man of few words. After the assassination, he said even less. It absolutely consumed him for months and months and months. This is where Jacqueline Kennedy, there he is, in fact, in his first television appearance about 4 or 5 months after the assassination, just sort of staring off into space on this show. Now, here's where Jacqueline Kennedy comes back into the story. She, of course, was struggling with her own issues. She also was completely consumed by her husband's death, obviously. Things were so bad for Jacqueline Kennedy, in fact, that in the spring of 1964, a lot of people don't know this, he actually contemplated suicide for a little while. And she told her priest, who was also her tennis coach, doubled as a priest and a tennis coach, true. She thought that Bobby and Ethel, who already had a lot of kids, could just take care of 2 more. She actually thought about it, but in the end, she told the priest that she probably really couldn't go ahead with it because of Caroline and John. So that was sort of the state of mind that both of them were in, and they were drawn to each other because of that, the shared grief that they had. But Robert's grief, I think, had sort of a different element to it. He often wondered whether perhaps any of his actions as Attorney General might have had something to do with his brother's murder. He wondered all the time about this. When he was Attorney General, he went after the mafia and Fidel Castro in Cuba, people like that, and he always wondered whether his brother's death perhaps was some kind of a payback for that. I don't think it was, but he worried about that for, I think, probably till his last day, in fact. And when, after President Kennedy was killed, Robert began his own soul searching for answers. This is the day of the assassination. President Kennedy came back to Washington. Robert, who was not in Dallas, but he got on the plane after it landed, and he went to see Jackie. You can see in her skirt there with the president's blood, escorted her off the plane. Well, that night, he spent the night in the White House and went to bed about 6 o'clock in the morning just for an hour or two, and a friend outside could hear Bobby weeping. He spent the night in the Lincoln bedroom, and Bobby was crying out, "Why, God? Why, God? Why did this happen?" And it kind of challenged his faith, too. Bobby Kennedy thought, well, if there's a God, why would something like this happen? Why would the President of the United States just get shot down like a dog in the street? Why do children in the world suffer if there's a God? He wondered about these kind of questions. So I think in the final, to come back to sort of the snake shedding skin theme, he changed after this. He became a new person. This is I think one of the final themes of his life. And in the spring of '64, Jackie and Bobby, some other people, they went off on a vacation to Antigua in the Caribbean, and the weather obviously was gorgeous. It was a wonderful place where they were. But Bobby never went outside. He stayed in his room the whole time reading this book that Jackie gave him. It's called The Greek Way by Edith Hamilton. And Bobby just devoured this book, and after his own death in 1968, it was found, I think, on his bookshelf in Virginia, and it was underlined, and there were things in the margins that he was writing. He really read this book, and I think it influenced him. He read the lessons, and in fact, in the tape of him talking about Martin Luther King's murder, he mentioned the Greeks a couple of times. Did you hear how he mentioned Aeschylus and some of that? The book was so influential for him that it stayed with him for the final 4 years of his life. And in this book, he learned about, say, the dangers of hubris and overreach. And he asked himself a question: was the Kennedy family perhaps too arrogant, too full of itself? And was President Kennedy's death perhaps somehow a God's way of putting the Kennedy family in their place? He had these kind of conversations in his mind. Just fascinating. There's one line in particular in the Greek way that stayed with him. All arrogance will reap harvest rich in tears. All arrogance will reap a harvest rich in tears. God calls men to a heavy reckoning for overweening pride. These were lines that deeply influenced him, made him, I think, a more humble man in the last few years of his life. So this was one of the key takeaways that he had. He thought that his family, the Kennedy family, was a noble family. He also thought they were doomed. I mean, this is pretty heavy stuff, I think, but it helped Robert come to terms not just with his brother's death, it also helped set him on a course for the next final 4 years of his life. So he changed a lot between 1963, the assassination, and his own assassination about 4.5 years later. I think he became more empathetic, perhaps less ruthless. There's always been this view that he was always just a very ruthless, and he always laughed about it. He said, and tried to make a joke about it, he said, well, people say I am ruthless. I am not ruthless. And if I find the person who is calling me ruthless, I shall destroy him, is what he said. Part of his support, of course, in the political realm was from those who wanted him to reclaim the White House. They thought it had been taken away unfairly in Dallas. But in many ways, Robert was not quite the politician that his brother was. John F. Kennedy was dashing, and he was charismatic, and he was always confident. Robert, on the other hand, and some of this, I think, came through in the film that we just saw, he was often shy, sometimes awkward, not quite sure of himself. He was often kind of a gloomy person, sometimes expected the worst in situations and everything. And while John F. Kennedy was always good on television, Robert, not so much. He didn't quite have the same kind of public charisma that his brother did. That being said, he had his own qualities, I think, that were different and certainly attractive. As I mentioned, after his brother's death, he became more humble, which I think is a very appealing quality in a politician. He became a visionary. He spoke of a better America, a better world, and he did so, I think, with this grace and an elegance that is rare to find in politicians. It's certainly missing today, if you know what I mean. So I'm not referring to anyone in particular. Now, the snake shedding skins mantra. Robert Kennedy in the 1950s was not the Robert Kennedy in the early 60s. He was not the Robert Kennedy in the mid-60s, and it was not the Robert Kennedy in the final year or two of his life. He was always evolving, always leaning forward. I think he became more aware from, not just from the book, but from just talking to others and listening and being reflective. He became more aware of the dangers, again, of a hubris and overreach. He became, just in short, a better man, I think, after his brother died. We also saw in the Guggenheim film, by the way, and this is just one of the more amazing things about him, he had this ability, I think, to connect with just about anyone. He was a liberal elite who went to Harvard. He was a multimillionaire, and yet he could connect with, as we saw, the poorest people in Appalachia, one of the poorest regions of my country. It didn't matter who you were. He could connect with you, talk to you on your own terms. That is really a magical thing for a politician to have. Not a lot of politicians have that quality. He didn't have it at first. He developed it. It was quite amazing. I think he had this incredibly intuitive ability to reach people in a way that was just really something. I mean, he offered a liberalism without elitism. He offered a populism without racism. Today, we sort of, our politicians have trouble doing that. I think he appealed to people, and this is one of the things that I like about him in retrospect the most. If he had won the nomination, his opponent would have been Richard Nixon, right? Well, Richard Nixon appealed to people with fear. Bobby Kennedy appealed to people with hope. There's such a stark difference. And Nixon was very cynical and cunning. Bobby, he really believed in hope. He really truly thought that things could be better if people worked together and worked for the common good. And I think the best example of this was the night, and we saw this in the film as well, the night that Martin Luther King was killed. There are a couple of things about that night that the film didn't mention. He was in Indianapolis, of course, the city in the Midwestern part of the United States. A lot of people in the crowd that night had not heard that King was killed. There were gasps of disbelief, sobbing in the audience after he told them, and they played some of the speech in the movie, and if you'll allow me, I just want to repeat a couple of lines from it. They're so powerful. I watched the whole thing earlier today, and it's just, I think, one of the more powerful, eloquent speeches I've ever heard, frankly, by any politician. Just remarkable. Here are the lines, again, that he said. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past. We will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness. It is not the end of disorder. But we want to improve the quality of our life, whether black or white, and we want justice for all human beings who abide in our land. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people, end quote. Can you name a politician anywhere who talks in those kind of powerful terms today? It's just amazing. I think Chris said in my introduction, I've been around, I think I've met 5 or 6 presidents, and I've worked now with 3 of them. I've never heard anyone talk in the way that he did in that movie. It was just incredibly powerful, and I'm glad that you had a chance to watch it. What you don't know about that speech, by the way, as powerful and eloquent and moving as it was all ad-libbed. It was completely off the cuff. The assassination of King happened so quickly. Kennedy didn't have time to write a speech. No one wrote anything for him. He got up and said all of that just literally off the top of his head. It was one of the most remarkable speeches that I have ever heard. And I think when I watch that, and we watch it now, to me, it still sends a chill down my spine if you watch the whole thing. It's just remarkable. And I think what even makes it all the more painful, I think, watching that, even after half a century, is sort of knowing that the same fate would soon befall him as it did King. It's just absolutely tragic. So Robert Kennedy went from the guy who did, in the early 60s, he, being honest here, he did some of his brother's dirty work. He went from that to a person who learned to appeal to the better angels of our nature. He was a guy who had been perceived as, again, cold and ruthless and cunning. He became a man who was compassionate, who cared deeply about others, the poor, the underprivileged, and the disadvantaged. Just remarkable. So in the end, that, I think, is the overwhelming legacy of Robert Kennedy. And I keep coming back to the two-word, the unanswerable question, what if? Think about that. What if? What if he had lived? There's no answer to that. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you tonight. It's a great honor for me to come all the way from Washington to Zurich, and I'm just very humbled. So thank you very much.